Thank you for, as Laura said, the endurance to stay with us for the fourth lecture in a row. This one, I'm afraid, is going to be probably the worst one you've ever attended and the worst one I've ever given. The reason is very simple. Most of the material I should discuss is originally in German. Some of it is in French, some of it is in Russian. I will, alas, talk about all of it in English. And I will present to you some of the most beautiful poetry ever written in these languages, but all in translation, when it's always, per definition, clumsy, and probably you will not be able to really enjoy and see why it is considered so beautiful. The title of tonight, Freud and Rilke. Do you have any idea who Rilke was and how he might have been connected to Freud? No one ever read Rilke?
I knew it. They were contemporaries and both lived in Germany, so they may or may not have met.
Freud never lived in Germany. I mean, Freud lived in Germany for less than a year.
Sorry, sure.
Yeah.
In like German-speaking.
Yeah. When Freud lived in Germany, here in Berlin, Rilke was 10 or 11 years old and was in Prague. But anyway, yes, contemporaries, though Rilke much younger, and German is their native language.
So Salomé, that lady?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. She introduced Rilke to Freud, yes. Any other ideas?
Salomé.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Lou Andreas Salomé, yeah.
He was an expressionist poet, and so that's one of the reasons why sitting next to Freud is interesting. Because he puts the unconscious on the page in a way that other kinds of performance or poets might not.
When you say he's an expressionist poet, which part of his poetry do you have in mind?
Anyway, the one you suggested.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
But
The elegies.
The way he talks about it is in three.
Yeah.
Well, the first elegy and the one that I pronounced with the D, the Duino, have you said? Duino.
There is a castle in northern Italy called Duino, where Rilke wrote these poems. So because of the castle, they're called Duino.
But in the first line, he calls out to the angels, and it's very, very sort of hyper-subjective, hyper-dramatic almost, over the top. Most of his poems, one I've read, are very extreme. They don't have middle ground. It's either something is horrid, that plants die, or it's absolutely amazing, that plants come back in the spring, or there's no sort of measured tone. It's always very expressivist.
Good. Anything else comes to your mind when you hear these words, Freud and Rilke? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, your selection of three elements was kind of obvious, and the third one deals with like the connection between man's relationship to his mother and man's relationship to a loved one, and it's full of like roughly psychoanalytic figures or associations. Although I wondered whether psychoanalysis was like already common sense or if he had that from somewhere else.
So 2017, we take it for granted that psychoanalysis was there first, and then other people learned from psychoanalysts and wrote their poetry. Might it be possible the other way around? There were some poetic notions, and then psychoanalysts learned from reading poetry, listening to music, going to the theater, and then made their theories based on what they've learned from the arts. Is that possible? It is?
But Freud didn't attend the virtual
Yes.
arts or anything like that.
Freud didn't. How about the other guys?
Particularly in the German tradition, the Sturmensagt, that predates a lot of what's happening around Freud and Jung, etc.
Yeah.
So there are precursors, I think.
Jung more openly, I would say, very deeply in the Romantic tradition. and Grodek too, and many other guys. And I'll try to show you another, hopefully, possible interpretation of that. Okay, so this is the fourth one in the series. We've started with Freud's lifetime. Probably by now you know it, when he lived and where he lived and so on and so on. Then we turned to his context, how he was reading very passionately since his early childhood in various languages, these very complicated classical poets and so on, Cervantes in Spanish, Homer in ancient Greek, Shakespeare in English and so on, translated from English, from French, from Greek and Latin and so on. Freud always surrounded by pieces of art. Freud in his famous collection, 2,000 pieces, some of them 4,000 years old. Then Freud's obsession with Michelangelo's Moses. When Freud managed to travel to Rome for the first time, he visited San Pietro in Vincoli church every day for 3 weeks to observe the statue and then write a paper about it. Freud's probably obsession with Shakespeare, I'm not sure you can see the red. It's Shakespeare, Hamlet, Laertes, Ophelia, Hamlet, Ophelia, in the most important letter for the beginning of psychoanalysis, the letter in which Freud explains what later on will be called Oedipus complex. Last week we talked about Gustav Mahler and Freud and how they met in Holland for 4 hours and discussed Mahler's childhood and music, and how Freud somehow reinforced his belief and persuaded Mahler that he should believe it too, that artistic creations are somehow conditioned on childhood experiences and the unconscious in its expressions. So tonight, Freud's walk with Rilke. While Freud walked with Mahler, he never wrote a paper about it. Freud most probably wrote a paper about Rilke in which he invented the walk. The walk never happened. This is a book published in the first years of the World War I. All across the German-speaking world, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the war. Even those who were not about nationalism were about purification. This included Rilke and Thomas Mann and many other people. So there was a book published, The Land of Goethe. The German people and soldiers should have been emboldened by this reminiscence that their heroic and famous and glorious past was connected to this most important poet of German language. What Shakespeare was to the English people and language, Goethe should have been for German people and language. So what better way to embolden your soldiers than to give them a book about Goethe? Among the people who were invited to contribute to the book was Freud. Freud's paper that was published in the book, its English title is On Transience. It quotes several verses from the end of the second part of Faust, the very famous part that is sung in Liszt and in Mahler and in many compositions. The paper is very short, about 1,000 words. So if your professors would give you a task to write a 1,000-word paper, that shouldn't take too much time and shouldn't be such a big effort. Why would we discuss the paper today? Freud's published 23 volumes of scientific papers, and on top of that, 20 volumes probably of correspondence. Why bother with a 1,000-word long essay? On Transience paper is a beginning of Freud's and then later on Melanie Klein's obsession with the topic of melancholy. Why do we get depressed? Which mechanisms are in the basis of it? Why is it important? Freud sensed that depression was profoundly connected to the mechanism of identification. Just simply put, you lose an extremely important object and then you start identifying with the lost object. And you feel the object is somehow inside of you, so separation is less painful. You may remember that. All of a sudden, you start liking, for instance, you're acutely in love, and there's a sudden breakup. And not long after that, you discover that your tastes have changed, your habits have changed. All of a sudden, you start behaving as the lost love object did. Or you lose a parent, and other situations like that. But this wouldn't make this paper very interesting. There is the 1917 paper, Mourning and Melancholy, and then later papers on personality structures. Everything is more elaborate, more sophisticated, more important there. Why would we stay with this one? So here's just briefly what the paper says. It opens with, "Not long ago, I went on a summer walk through a smiling countryside in the company of a taciturn friend and of a young but already famous poet." At the beginning, no one paid too much attention to this. Freud was walking, he met many people, he was very often for summer holidays in northern Italy, and so on. The poet, says Freud, was disturbed by the thought that all this beauty was fated to extinction, while Freud asserts that the transience of what is beautiful entails an increase in its worth, saying famously that transience value is scarcity value in time. So things that are transient, things that will not be with us, that will disappear, we value more exactly because of this scarcity. Freud is superior as always. He sees better, he is emotionally more mature, and he diagnoses his disputants' problem as a revolt in their minds against mourning. So Freud starts this topic that will later on will be the basis of his explanation of melancholy, of depression. I'm not able to mourn, so I become depressed. The work of mourning will not take place in me, so I will end up being depressed. This realization was intriguing enough to lead him to initiate a study of relations between mourning, identification with the lost object, and creative production. And over the next several years, these papers will appear one by one. Again, nothing very much fun. 1966. Herbert Lehmann published a paper in the German-American Imago, a very famous journal even today, which publishes papers about the relationship between psychoanalysis on one side and arts and culture on the other side. Founded in 1939 by the dying Sigmund Freud and called American to replace the initial Imago, which was the first psychoanalytic journal ever. Founded in 1912 in Vienna, published in German even before the Zeitschrift, the first psychoanalytic journal. Lehmann, in his paper, claimed these two people Freud walked around and talked with were Lou Andreas Salomé and Rainer Maria Rilke. Over the next 50 years, there were many people who grew interested in that. The number of papers and books about Lou Salomé in German and in English and in French was rising year by year. And the number of books about Rilke probably is impossible to determine. There were several basic questions. Why would Freud hide their identities? There was no reason for him not to use their names. By the second half of the 1960s, Freud-Salomé correspondence was published. One volume, first in English, then in German. Everyone knew about their correspondence. Everyone knew she published psychoanalytic papers, analyzed people, and so on and so on. There was no secret about that. In the paper, he doesn't say anything that would in any way tarnish Rilke's reputation. So why did he hide them? The second question was where and when did the walk take place? So was it northern Italy? Was it Vienna? Where did they meet? Where did they walk around? And finally, was Rilke analyzed? For German literature scholars, this would be an extremely important topic. Was he analyzed? What did he discover? How that influenced his later production? Can we pinpoint and say this was the year and then look at his production up to that moment and after that moment and look for differences that psychoanalysis may have brought about? Do you recognize this photograph? It's a very famous photograph and a rather embarrassing one for the history of psychoanalysis. This is the Weimar Congress of 1911. So in September 1911, psychoanalysts have met in Weimar. This is probably the psychoanalytic community of Europe at that moment. There might be a couple of guys in England as well. Ernst Jones is here. Here, this is Ernst Jones. So the London at least has a representative, or the London people are there too. 1910, there were 50 of them. 1911, you see, a couple of dozens. This here is Freud. This is Carl Gustav Jung. This is Sándor Ferenczi. Freud is surrounded by his best friends and his most important collaborators. 1911, it is not completely obvious, but he still hopes Jung would be the heir to the throne. And with Ferenczi, he travels for summer holidays and he wants his daughter to marry Ferenczi and so on and so on. This row here, Emma Jung, Jung's wife, and Lou Salomé, a very especially important person for Freud already in 1911. Why is the photograph embarrassing? Look at Jung and Freud and Ferenczi. Freud is suspiciously tall. And the reason for it is he's standing on a box. Most probably, he didn't want a photograph to immortalize the fact that Jung was so much taller than he was. So he stood on a box so that he is not only the most important, the founder, the genius, the prophet, and so on, but he is the tallest one as well. So 1911 already you can see Lou Salomé central stage in the world of psychoanalysis. Do you have an idea where she was before that? Who she was before that? If she were not here, if she were not psychoanalyst, would we today talk about her?
She had a relationship with Nietzsche.
Yeah. What kind of a relationship?
Were they going to get married to almost appease her parents, so she would be living with a man and he would be seen as equal?
Platonic.
Sorry?
Platonic.
Yeah. That's another very...
50 years old at the time.
Yes. At this photograph, she's exactly 50. She was born 1861. She was born in Russia. Her name, Luisa Gustavovna, a Russian name. Then she comes to study in Europe, in Switzerland. And the moment when she meets Nietzsche, he is still very young. He is, so to say, downhill. He's still in the city. He is not in Sils Maria. He claims she is the most extraordinary person he's ever met. Their relationship, short, platonic, and she goes on. She marries a professor of Eastern languages from Göttingen. His name is Andreas. So she's Lou Andreas Salomé. She marries him on the condition that the marriage will never be consummated. So again, they live in a marriage that's platonic. She's published several very early, very important books on Ibsen, on Nietzsche. She was one of the first to recognize the importance of these geniuses of the second half of the 20th century. At a certain moment, she starts reading psychoanalysis. She decides she would like to meet Freud and learn and become a psychoanalyst. Freud, in a letter to Ferenczi, writes, Mrs. Andrea Salomé is interested in our work. Then he writes like, be careful, many steps lead to her cave, but none outside of it. So like, she's very dangerous. If you deal with her, you might get mad, you might get killed. She's very dangerous, be very careful. She comes to Freud, and in a way, Freud is fascinated. She joins his circle very soon, and she is allowed to practice as a clinical psychoanalyst, although she's not a medical doctor and has not a single day of training of that kind. A side story is connected with this guy, Victor Tausk. Tausk is a young medical doctor in Vienna at that moment, and most probably he and Lou Salomé become lovers. So Tausk is drafted, he goes to the World War I. I like this part of the story particularly because he was the Austro-Hungarian medical doctor in the Austro-Hungarian army in Belgrade, in the psychiatric hospital where I used to work decades later. He had a lot of experience with persons who suffered from psychosis and wrote one of the first psychoanalytic papers about psychosis experience, on the influencing machine. He comes back from the war and he wants to be analyzed by Freud. And Freud refuses and sends him to Alain Deutsch, who is younger than Tausk, less experienced than he is, and he thinks that's an insult. So in 1919, aged 40, he commits suicide. He leaves behind him 2 letters, one of these is for Freud, another one is for his best friend with a request to take care of his kids. He even had children at the moment when he committed suicide. Now, Paul Rosen, to my mind a very important historian of psychoanalysis, published a book, Brother Animal, on the Freud-Tausk case. And Rosen believed he had enough evidence to prove that all of this happened because Freud was jealous of Tausk, because Lou Salomé chose Tausk and not Freud. I cannot tell you whether that was true or not. I'm just telling you the argument Rosen provided. So who's Rilke in this story? Let me tell you just a brief introduction to this. I'll show you 2 excerpts from a letter Rilke received in 1926. That's the year when he died. In 1925, there was a rather large celebration of Rilke's 50th birthday. So many journal issues, many books, many events were organized to celebrate the 50th birthday of probably the most important German poet of that moment, although Rilke lived in Switzerland at that time. And there's a very painful story related to that. Here in Berlin, at that moment, there is a Russian painter. His name is Leonid Pasternak. He painted Rilke's portrait when Rilke was about 25 years old. So he looks at photographs from the newspapers and paints another portrait and sends the portrait to Switzerland. And Rilke replies and tells him, I can still read Russian after 25 years. And when I was in Paris, I've read some poems by your son and they touched me deeply. The letter arrives to Berlin and Leonid Pasternak sends it to his son, Boris Pasternak, in Russia, in the Soviet Union. Pasternak receives the letters and he's out of his mind. The poet who is the basis of his spirituality, who is the basis of his poetry, the most important person for him in the entire world, has read his poems and liked them and writes a letter about that. So that is how the correspondence called the Summer 1926 correspondence starts. Rilke, Pasternak and Marina Tsvetaeva, a very famous Russian Soviet poet, are corresponding for several months and then Rilke prematurely dies at the age of 51. In her first letter to Rilke, this is what Tsvetaeva writes to him. You are not my favorite poet. You are not my most favorite poet. Most favorite is a comparison. You are a force of nature, or that is still too little. You are the fifth element embodied, essential poetry, or still too little. You are what poetry is being born out of, out of, and what is larger than it, you. And then continues with, you are the only one who said anything new to God. So, there might be an argument who is the most important Russian poet of the 20th century, and people might have various opinions. Some would tell you Tsvetaeva. So she thinks Rilke is not the best, the most important, the favorite poet. He is the poetry itself. He is the force of nature. Why? How did he deserve all that? So just basic facts. Rilke was born 1875 in Prague. His language is German. He is, as you can see, 19 years younger than Freud, 14 years younger than Lou Salomé, the same age as Carl Gustav Jung. When he will meet Lou Salomé, the two of them will travel twice to Russia by the end of the 19th century. And Rilke will claim these travels to be extremely important for his mostly spiritual development. He believed he saw freely religious people there. Of these 2 summer travels, all in all probably 3 or 4 months, he'll learn the Russian well enough to be able to translate Pushkin and even middle-aged Russian, and 25 years later, in this correspondence with Tsvetaeva and Pasternak, he would use Russian expressions from time to time. Other than that, by the way, he translated from Italian and Spanish and wrote a collection of poetry in French and so on. After they will return from the second travel, and yes, during these travels to Russia, one very important thing was they wanted to meet Tolstoy. Tolstoy was at that time sort of a quasi-religious guru. As they return, they separate. He gets married and his daughter is born in 1902. The same year, he leaves his wife and his daughter and moves to Paris. He wants to become a private secretary to Auguste Rodin, the most important sculptor of the time. I cannot guarantee this, but I don't think he met his daughter ever until very late in his life. They started corresponding when she was 20-something and he was around 50. But I don't think he ever met her. Before her first birthday he left, and I'm not sure he ever met her. He stays in Paris for some time, and Paris for him is the source of everything he doesn't like. Crowded, noisy, too many people, too many hospitals, people are dying in these hospitals, and he wants solitude. He wants to be far away from other people so that he can write poetry. 1910, he publishes his only novel, The Notebooks of Malte, Laurids, Brigge. It's been written for 8 years. The moment he came to Paris, he started working on it, and then it took him 8 years to finish the novel. Between 1910 and 1923, there will be just scattered poems here and there, but also periods, very long periods of months and years when he is completely empty and he cannot write a single verse. The two most important collections of poetry were written within several weeks' time. In an attack, so to say, of inspiration that he felt was larger than he himself and that he could have broken down under the influence of it. Several months, these are finished, he remains living in isolation, and he feels, I'm done with the German language. I'm done with the German language. All the possibilities of expression in German, I have already exhausted. So I need to switch to another language and then look for ways to express myself there. So his last collection of poetry is in French. Happened later on with Beckett. Beckett wanted to write in French so that he would have no style. Because it was a foreign language, he would be an absolute anti-stylist. Rilke died 1926 in Switzerland, aged 51. So Freud was not only 19 years older, Freud lived for 13 years longer. When Rilke and Lou Salomé met, so this is the two of them in Russia. I don't know whether you can recognize by the clothing that this is Russia. It was in Munich. She was 35, he was 21. They met somewhere and he immediately sent her poems and introduced himself by that, and then they got introduced personally a couple of days later and they became lovers. He was her first lover. We don't know how that came to be, why she insisted on a platonic marriage and then consummated her relationship with Rilke. And Rilke, aged 21, was somehow transformed into a man by Lou Salomé. I'll return to that very soon. One of the things is that his name was changed from the form René that she felt was too feminine to Rainer that should have been more masculine. With René Maria Rilke, she felt many people might think this is a woman. And he himself might have thought he was too feminine. In his letters and Rilke-Salomé correspondence is several hundred pages, a thick volume, and psychoanalysts love it. He wrote to her, "Take me, give me form, finish me." At the moment he met her, he felt he was not a finished product. His identity, his personality was too diffuse. He needed someone to help him stabilize and become a solid personality structure, to use contemporary jargon. This is late 1890s. Psychoanalysis more or less does not exist, or people do not know about it, and Lou Salomé is not a psychoanalyst at that time. He just needs this extraordinary person and her strength to help him somehow become a person. Why? What happens to you so that you turn 21 and you need someone else to give you form and finish you? Here's just one reason. Here's Rilke before the time he was supposed to go to school. Tell us. That was a very significant exclamation.
No, it was somebody else. But his mom dressed him as a girl, I believe, because she's
Yes.
his daughter that died
Exactly.
5 years ago.
So this is Rilke's name, René Karl Wilhelm Johann Joseph Maria Rilke, that his mother shortened into René Maria Rilke. Because there was a girl who died, because she had a daughter who died, she then dressed Rilke as a girl, and he talked about himself in feminine, and she addressed him in feminine forms. So before going to school, he most probably thought he was a girl. In communication, inside the family at least, he was like a girl. What's the next important thing in his growing up? They sent him to military school. So imagine how the boy, dressed as a girl, addressing himself in feminine, feels in a military school. Absolutely the most horrible years. By some accounts, young Rilke has a sort of anxiety attacks every time he feels the erection. He has no idea what this part of his body is, what it is about, and what he should do about it. And then you send him to military school.
Sorry, what age are we talking about?
I think 10 or 11.
Okay.
Very young. Psychoanalysts like this one for an additional reason. There are many examples, and I mentioned that last week in the case of Malte as well. Especially at that time when death rate of children was extremely high. That there were groups of kids that we nowadays call replacement children. There is a child, the child dies, a feeling of loss, of mourning, sometimes even of guilt, starts ruling in a way the parent's life. And they have no idea how to overcome it. Contemporary attachment research tells us that if one of the parents loses an important figure 2 years before the child is born, the probability of disorganized attachment pattern rises extremely. So parental loss and preoccupation with the loss. So consequently, not enough emotional availability on the part of the parent, and the child's development will be problematic. In these situations, it turns out many creative artists of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century were in the position to be brought up as a replacement for another person. This means they somehow don't leave their lives. It does not have to be as extreme as in this case, that they become a child of the opposite gender. But they live someone else's life. They have someone else's toys, someone else's clothing, someone else's tastes, name, and so on and so on. Turns out many of them, when they grow up, are on this quest of discovering their own identity and what it is that they really like and how they would like to express themselves. If this is combined with a talent, then you get an important artist, like Rilke or like Mahler or several others at least. Who's the guy on the photograph? This is Rilke.
Oh no.
Yes. Age 27 or 28 in Paris with Rodin. He is applied to be his private secretary. I don't think Rodin paid anything. And Rilke came there, spoke French, improved his French, and learned somehow, identified with the person he considered the most important artist of the time. Several years later, he will be on a tour of Germany, reading excerpts from his book on Rodin. That's a very important and short book. I think you might enjoy reading it. If you've ever been at the Musée Rodin in Paris, the museum is now in the house where Rodin lived the last years of his life. That used to be a hotel. But Rilke discovered it and recommended it to Rodin, so Rodin moved there, and the museum is there now.
What was the name of the book, sorry?
Rodin's name is in the title. I think the book of Rodin, the book on Rodin. Should be easy to find on Amazon, Rilke Rodin. When Rilke arrives there and meets Rodin for the first time, the basic thing he discovers is this man is completely opposite to everything I am. His impressions. Rodin makes an inexplicably strong, extraordinary impression. Enormous and strong. Before he even enters the room, you notice that these hundreds of lives are in fact one life, uplifting of one power and one will. Now, in the novel to which we will turn in a couple of minutes, Rilke writes, Days are going by, and sometimes I can hear the life going by. Nothing has happened yet. Around me, there is nothing real, and I'm again falling apart and dividing. While I would so much like to be whole and uplifted. Now, this is not very much. Reading two books in parallel, I've noticed that these are in contradistinction to one another. But all descriptions of Rodin's working energy, of his absolute dedication to his work, that Rodin works for countless hours every day, while Rilke is so often exhausted and feeble and cannot think, cannot work, and it takes him a whole day to write one letter and then cannot write poetry, and so on and so on. The period with Rodin is extremely important because Rilke's poetry starts to change. And his collections of the first decade of the 20th century are significantly different than previous ones. When he was 20-something years old, the time when he met Lou Salomé, the time of his travels to Russia, his poetry is very often about religious, spiritual topics, death, God, knights, mythology, and so on and so on. With Rodin, he becomes an observer. He starts observing what can be seen, for instance, in the parks around Paris, and he starts writing poems about animals in the zoo, about flowers in the park, and so on. He learns how to become more distant. Becoming more distant psychologically means being more self-contained, means having better formulated boundaries. Then you can be more distant. The first collections of poetry and relationships were by a person who needed someone to give him form. With Rodin, it seems the form somehow starts appearing. The novel, as I mentioned, was published 1910. It took Rilke 8 years to finish it. And last week I told you, when we were talking about these 5 thinkers, scientists and artists who changed the world at the beginning of the 20th century, I would try now to argue that Rilke's novel was far less known than Joyce's Ulysses, but it had the same function in the German-speaking world that Ulysses had in the English one and internationally. First of all, the novel is not a novel in a true sense of the word. These are notes, notebooks. So the book is a collage of letters, diary notes, and then notes of all various sorts, combined in most different ways. Very frequently, one note would be several lines. Sometimes it would be 4 pages. Very often it takes a lot of work to realize what is it that he's talking about. Very soon I will show you one of the examples. During these 8 years that Rilke spent working on the novel, there were long periods of exhaustion or writer's blocks, whatever you like to call them. There would be periods when he writes poems. There would be periods when he is preoccupied with moving from one city to another, and so on. Then the moment comes when he feels he is capable of working, and then he does not do anything else but write for some time. And then again, it's out, and he has to wait, and he has no idea how long he will have to wait. In the next decade, he would be waiting for a couple of years at some moments. The book is about the basic topics he wrote about in his poetry and letters and everywhere, and that most of these big guys, metaphysical guys, write about. This is the first sentence. It gives, at the beginning, it gives the street in Paris and the date in September 1902, and says, here then is where people come to live. I'd have thought it more a place to die in. This is about Paris. The first part of the novel is about the phenomenon of death. So, this young Danish guy, whose name initially was Malte Laurids Larsen, but then Larsen was changed in Brigge, so that the names are rhyming. Malte Laurids Brigge, Rainer Maria Rilke. So Malte is walking around Paris, seeing hospitals, ill and dying. And he thinks about death. And the most important motive of that part of the book is what you will find in several of Rilke's poems. Death of one's own. In the 20th century, he says, we die from illnesses. We don't die from death. We have diagnoses and illnesses and cures and hospitals, but we have forgotten about death. And there is a poem which says, I think, let God give everyone the death of one's own. Tell us.
Sorry, I can't speak. No.
Sorry?
I can't. I know this
I thought you were saying it in German.
Sorry, the death
Of one's own.
one's own,
Yeah. So Malte tells us in great detail how his grandfather died and how the death of his own was loud and large and persistent, so he screamed for days and days because his death was like that. Then he comes to formulation that death is a kernel inside of every one of us. If there's going to be fruit, it will come out of the death we're bringing inside ourselves. This is, because tonight we're trying to establish connections to psychoanalysis, we don't have to. This is a book published in 1910. The idea of death and death drive and why is death important and melancholy and so on is yet to become important to psychoanalysts. And in psychoanalysis of that time, it will be equaled with the issue of drive, of biological force, which Freud believed somehow out of the darkness in our personality makes us do something. In Rilke, death is someone you should get to know, and your death is not equal as anyone else's death. It is not a biological category. And out of these getting to know your death, you might create something. Trying to evade getting to know your death leads to a very sterile life in denial, so to say. So that's the opening of the novel and one of the major topics. This is the last paragraph. What did they know about who he was? He was now so terribly difficult to love, and he felt there was only the one who was capable of it, but he was not yet willing. Most probably will never know what he meant. But there were several versions of the ending of a novel. One of them is a beautiful description of the visit to Tolstoy. How he and Lou Salomé, unnamed, are walking from the train to the house and so on and so on. In the end, he opted for another version, and that's a version about the intransient love. So Rilke, by the end of the novel, claims that life may be very rich and beautiful for those who love, but that life must be extremely agonizing for those who are loved. And he describes growing up of a hero of that note who was trying to evade being loved. And even when his dogs would come to him, happy to see him, he would evade them because he didn't want to be loved. And he later on ran away from his house as far as possible, trying to let's use again psychoanalytic concepts, the bones of love, the shackles of love. He wanted to remain free, and the condition for being free is not to be loved. At the same time, he claimed it was most noble to love someone, but in a very clear and again noble and sophisticated way, without any sort of possessiveness and so on. So the novel in the beginning is about death, at the end is about love. Death is extremely important and you should get to know it or her. And love is also extremely important and you should try to avoid it at any cost. In the meantime, the basic, so to say, methodological point of the novel is that narration has disappeared. On one level, Malte writes about the problem of his generation that there are no storytellers anymore. It's impossible to hear an interesting story anymore. The storytelling has disappeared as a trade, as a capacity. And on the other hand, he says that he is broken and that out of an impression he must become a written one. So before 1910, what Rilke wants to tell you is that your personal identity is a narration, is a story. And then his time is witnessing the disappearance of storytellers. Clear? So one line, the line to the past, leads from Rilke to Lou Salomé to Nietzsche, to the disappearance of the narrative. The god of the metaphysics is dead. There are no big stories anymore. The storytelling is dead. Don't give me your huge ideological narratives that I need to comply. I have my own story if I find out how I'm going to tell it. Another line toward future is to what will happen in the 1960s and 70s and the beginnings of the so-called narrative psychology. One strand in psychology, mostly about qualitative research, but which tells you basically the same thing. Your identity is the story you're telling about yourself. If you want to radicalize it, as many coherent stories you can tell about yourself, that many identities you have. And then all of a sudden, psychology was all about experiments and so on and so on. Psychology becomes interested in autobiographical memory. What is it that I remember about myself? Why do I select not to remember some things? And so on and so on. So when it comes to this that I call methodological point, maybe the literature scholar should take his part here. Most of the people will tell you With Ulysses, 1923, there is definitely no way back. With Finnegan's Wake, we're in another universe. Rilke's novel is published 13 years before Choices. It was published in German, so few people read it and didn't become so influential and famous. By the way, around year 1960, there was a guy who wrote about 300 tragedies and a huge number of theater plays, who wrote his first book of sonnets like Mozart at the age of 5 or 6, and his first theater play at 11. And I bet you none of us has ever read any of his work. His name was Lope de Vega, and were he English, he would be as famous as Shakespeare is, and were Shakespeare Spanish, no one would know about him nowadays. So this is one excerpt. I hope you'll bear with me. Try to figure out what this is about. Unheard, giving back to the universe only what the universe can bear. Bedouin out hunting would have galloped by in the distance, superstitiously. But merchants would have flung themselves on the ground at the edges of your music as if you were a storm. Only a few solitary lions would have circled round you at night, afraid of themselves, menaced by their own agitated blood. For who will retrieve you now from lecherous ears? Who will drive them from the concert halls, the mercenaries with their sterile hearing that whores and never once conceives? Semen sprays out, and they stay beneath it like prostitutes, playing with it. Or it falls like Onan's semen among all of them while they lie there in their unachieved gratification. But, Master, if, somewhere, a virginal young man were to lay his wakeful ear beside your music, he would die of bliss, or he would carry infinity inside him, and his fertilized brain would burst from sheer birth. What is this? Do you like it? Not really? Complicated, of course. It's German in the original, it has to be complicated. If you want to be a poet in German, you have to make it unbearably complicated. Remember the first sentence of Dr. Faustus. You can study it for years. What is this? I mean, no one can ever solve it. Rilke was walking in one of the streets in Paris, and there was a shop, and he saw Beethoven's Death Mask. And looking at the face of Beethoven dead, he thought about the impression Beethoven's music made on him. And so here's one of the notes. Beethoven is a storm. There is a piano sonata called The Tempest. And so on and so on. The book, at some points, is extremely poetic. And if you expect a novel with narrative and a plot and so on, some parts of it will be completely disappointing. More or less at that time, Rilke writes several very unusual poems. A couple of them are retelling of very well-known stories from ancient mythology. For instance, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes, or Alcestis. They're very long, and they have a high dosage, so to say, of narrativity. More than you would expect of a poem. Yet they are poetry. So the line, the boundary between prose and poesis, it's blurred. The boundary between fiction and philosophy is blurred. The boundary between his personal reminiscences and, for instance, Beethoven, blurred. I I highly recommend it to you. I've read it dozens of times. One of the most important books I've ever read. The novel is finished and published in 1910. And Rilke is in complete depression. He's depleted, he's completely empty, he has no idea what to do, he has no inspiration to write, he doesn't know where to live, who to live with, and so on and so on. When he is deeply depressed, what does he do? He writes to Salomé. Several years they were not in contact. Now he needs her to tell him, would he benefit from psychoanalysis? So his long letter is basically about, what do you, who are so much wiser and more experienced than I am, think about the idea whether I need psychoanalysis or not? By the moment her reply arrives and she recommends a psychoanalyst to whom he could write, he changes his mind. Rilke is one of the historically first examples of artists who believed psychoanalysis would destroy their creativity. He was one of those who believed that creativity was based on suffering. As long as I suffer, there will be poetry. The moment I become happy, poetry will disappear. He just says it in far more stylistically superior ways. A sort of cowardice is frightening me away from psychoanalysis. He believed it were a treatment that produced disinfected souls, and he was in favor of therapy through creative work. So if you want to discuss whether there could be something as writing therapy, arts therapy, reading therapy, bibliotherapy, many different names nowadays, this is one of the historically first examples. A guy who believes psychoanalysis could be replaced by writing poems. He uses an expression in one of the letters. Unfortunately, I didn't have that book with me, I couldn't quote it for you. But he identifies psychoanalysis with the schoolmaster's red ink. Like in school, your teachers correct your tests with red ink, he believed psychoanalysts would correct him with red ink. And he didn't want that. It seems as soon as he's in contact with Salomé, as soon as she starts replying to his letters, he feels better. And he decides, I don't need psychoanalysis. He goes to Italy, as I told you, not far away from Trieste. There is a castle called Duino. It belonged to his friend and benefactor, the Countess, I think the pronunciation is von Thun und Taxis. That's a family that rules in Regensburg, I believe. And she allowed him to stay there as long as he needed it. Hoped he would write some poetry there. He arrives there. It's late afternoon, the dark starts falling. He's in a boat. There's a guy rowing, and he should take him across the lake to the castle. And at a moment, Rilke hears the rhythm of rowing and of the water, and the verse starts coming from somewhere. He rushes into the house and writes the first Duino elegy. It is complete, it is ready. It just needs to be written down. There is no work, no corrections, no improvements, nothing. It's complete. He believes it has come from the outside, from somewhere else. There was a source of inspiration that was not his own psychological, personal, but came from somewhere. Number 1, written 1912. Then we have to wait for many years for the others. Where did finally Freud and Rilke and Lou Salomé meet? Munich, Bayerischer Hof. 1913, the historically very important Psychoanalytic Congress. Do you have an idea why it is important? The last time Freud and Jung met was here in the lobby of this hotel. After that, they divorced through letters, but never met again. So this is a very tense, problematic Congress. Freud believes this will happen. He plots against Jung with others. Jung wants to go his own way. None of them, I think, is to be proud of the event. And in the lobby of the hotel, which at that time probably didn't look like this, Lou Salomé and Rilke and Freud and most probably some other people sat together and talked. The most we know about it, or more or less all we know about it, is from Lou's journal, which is otherwise very detailed. Here it doesn't give any deep insights. And this is not an important event in anyone's life. So I've checked. This is, to my mind, the best psychoanalytic study of Rilke. It's just mentioned that Rilke met Freud. It is a footnote in Binion's Frau Lou, and it is not mentioned at all in Freud's biographies. Let's pretend it was important, and let's see what the importance might have been. After this brief meeting that Freud will describe as a walk in nature and smiling countryside and so on and so on, there is the war, and for a short time Rilke is drafted, and again it's a horror to him to be in the military surrounded by men and so on and so on. He moves to Switzerland immediately after this experience, to this so-called castle of Miseau, and he lives in solitude for the next probably 10 years. In the book that maybe is the most famous of everything he has written, Letters to a Young Poet, he writes something like, "What is required is only this, solitude, immense inner solitude, to withdraw into yourself and not to meet anyone for hours. That we must be able to achieve." That, in his opinion, is a precondition for creativity. At the same time, but in a way like an underground part of his biography, are the stories of several lovers. Some of them much younger than he was. One of them, the mother of a later on famous painter, Balthus, who are with him on and off in his solitude, and some of them are with him in the last months as he's dying. But once he gets there, he never returns to a large city. He never returns to Germany. He never lives in Munich, Prague, Berlin, anywhere. I believe 1915, he pays a visit to Freud in Vienna. He comes to Freud's famous office, and it's just one visit. They spend some time together, they talk. It is not exactly obvious nowadays what they talked about. Rilke complained of some psychological problems. Freud tried to provide advice. But in his letter to Lou Salomé, Freud says no lasting bond with Rilke was possible to establish. No lasting bond. He wants his solitude. Bonds are unusual, irregular, temporary, on and off. To stay in Vienna at least for several months and come regularly to Freud probably was absolutely against his nature. Freud, again, as in the case of Mahler, was completely unaware, it seems, who he was talking to. It is obvious that his children adored Rilke, At the time, Rilke was in Freud's house in Vienna. Freud was aware that his son Ernst, who will decades later edit the first collection of Freud's correspondence, adored Rilke. And we have no evidence that he ever asked his son, why? What is it that you like about this guy? Now, years later, before the elegies were published, one handwritten copy was sent to Lou Andrea Salomé. She was staying in Vienna with Freud family, and we know that Anna Freud was more than happy, as they like to say it in the US, to read the poems before they were published. And she adored Rilke as well. But we have no evidence that Freud ever read any of these. In 1919 or 20, Rilke got a book about the exhibition of what nowadays we call art brut. Paintings and drawings by patients collected by a medical doctor in Heidelberg who put up an exhibition. And there was a book published about it. And Rilke wrote to Lou Salomé, I think even sent one copy of the book and asked her to give the book to Freud. He believed Freud would be very interested in the artistic production of psychiatric patients. To the best of our knowledge, Freud never replied, not even said thank you. So on his side, it somehow was dead. In the letter to Lou Salomé, Freud identifies with Rilke and his creative block, as if Freud ever suffered from a creative block, having in mind the fact that he wrote 23 volumes, thousands of pages. But that's the only poem. Rilke became for Freud the symbol of artistic inspiration and temperament. So he was one of those Freud never wanted to be similar to. If you remember what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Freud wanted to be a natural scientist, a neurologist, a true scientist. Poems, arts, that was not interesting for him. Now, what Freud would have learned? Psychoanalysts nowadays, as was already noticed and mentioned this evening, consider the third elegy to be the psychoanalytic one. And we don't know, I at least like to look at it like that. We don't know where the influence came from and in which direction it went. So now, what we can do, this is a link to a YouTube recording where you can hear the third elegy in German. This here is a link that would show us the third elegy in English. Okay. Beyond the level of language, what is the idea of all this? What did the author want to say? What did he mean to say? If you read the whole cycle, and many times, there are several very complicated levels. Angels and how they communicate to humans. You can even call it mythological and so on and so on. But to focus on what is our idea for tonight and not to stay here until midnight, why is this called psychoanalytic elegy? What is psychoanalytic about it? At this time, the first half of the 1920s, was psychoanalysis about this? Children and mothers and anxiety coming from the blood?
When their children speak to you, so yes, that sister speaks to him.
Yeah, that's when you think about him as a person. But if you think about the first half of the 1920s, there is a very strict, explicit rule in Freud's thinking. The most important relationship we have is the relationship with the father. The relationship you once had with your mother is too early, not so significant, Freud will not deal with it. 1923, when this so-called psychoanalytic elegy was published, even if Rilke had read all of the psychoanalytic literature that was published by that moment, he wouldn't have learned a lot about this. 1926 to 1933, we will have several important crises in the psychoanalytic circles because people like Otto Rank and Sándor Ferenczi and Georg Grodek try to tell Freud, mothers are important. Relationship with the mother is important. And Freud doesn't want to hear. So that's one of the reasons I believe this goes ahead of its time. I don't know how easy or difficult it was to follow, especially if this was the first hearing or reading. If you try to read it slowly, I think you will discover huge amount of topics that we deal with today in the world of psychoanalysis. How is it that the mother who enters the room makes me feel calm again? I'm anxious, I'm afraid of the dark or whatever, and the mother comes in and immediately everything is different. How come? Why? What does she have to do with the dark? Why do I trust her more than myself? And so on and so on. Even more important, and then we can stay with that one longer if you will. This is an excerpt from the finale of the number 4. Can you read it?
Yeah.
No? O hours of childhood, when behind the images there was more than the past, and in front of us was not the future. We were growing, it's true, and sometimes urged that we soon grew up, half for the sake of those others who had nothing but their grow-upness, and were yet on our own happy with timelessness, and stood there in the space between world and plaything, at a point that from first beginnings had been marked out for pure event. Who shows a child just as they are? Who sets it in its constellation and gives the measure of distance into its hand? Couple more verse and number 4 is finished. Anything interesting in here? Written 1923. Do you recognize anything unusual in here? In the second half of the 20th century, there will be many developments in the world of psychoanalysis. At least one of the most important, if not the most important, is the theory and clinical praxis of an English pediatrician by the name of Donald Winnicott. And Winnicott believed that the basis of development, at least the basis of his theory, was in what was called transitional space. And the transitional space was the space between the baby and the toy. We start separating from the mother, Winnicott believed, by having the first possession, the first non-me. And that's the toy that's special for me. My blanket, my teddy bear, a soft and a warm object I can put in my mouth, and then I feel relaxed again. Mother goes out of the room, I cannot fall asleep, I take my blanket, I put it in my mouth, I fall asleep again. Have you ever seen that? In Charlie Brown at least. The child is about 4 years of age and the parents can go out or travel or whatever, it's okay. but my teddy bear is missing and it's horrible. It's the end of the world. You remember it? These objects that are especially important, Winnicott believed were transitional objects. They were at the same time inside and outside of me. They were my possessions. I was aware they were not the same as my mother. At the same time, when I put them inside my mouth, I feel relieved. So they can become a part of my personality structure, somehow solidify me, and help me fight off the anxiety. The transitional space is the space of playfulness. This is where I can play. This is where one day, in Winnicott's opinion, cultural experience will be located. Inside the transitional space, the grammar, the social rules, the algebra, and so on, the notation system will come. Playfulness is a state of selflessness. I don't think about myself. I forget who I am. I forget where I am. I just play. I become what I play about. The hero or the villain or the victim or the dog or the car or whatever. And you may remember, I like to remind students about that. I may remind you as well. You may remember the moment when they tell you you have to go asleep and you cry because you want to play. And tomorrow is a different world. It will not be possible to continue to play tomorrow. You remember that? So that's here, in the world of timelessness, which is prepared for the pure event, which one day will be the ecstatic creative experience that only few adults have, or ecstatic erotic experience that hopefully more adults might have, but which most of the kids naturally have. Now, in Winnicott, the theory is very rich. I'm sorry we don't have time to go into all the details. What is it that a mother should do, that there are two types of mothers, and so on and so on. But where, in Freud, were drives, in Winnicott is play. Where Freud was focused on how the drives are in conflict and the superego and so on, Winnicott is focused on whether the child plays and in which way, whether the adult who comes for psychotherapy is playful, and if not, we first have to help him learn how to be playful, and only then psychotherapy can start. Now, I cannot give you any evidence that Winnicott has ever read this. There's just one sentence in an otherwise hefty volume of Winnicott biography, which says that when Rilke met his second wife, Claire Britton, she introduced him to German poetry, most importantly Rilke. That was by the end of the World War I. The paper on the transitional object and transitional space, transitional object and transitional phenomena, was published in 1953. So I cannot tell you Winnicott exactly read this, or he learned German or anything like that, but he did read Rilke. I'll show you just a couple of things before we close, and we'll close in a couple of minutes.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes?
So the adults lose playfulness, why would that happen? Is there theories behind why that transition changes into adults? They would have to learn playfulness again.
In Winnicott, it is very, in much detail, discussed why some kids never develop it. What could be the problem with the mother, with the environment, and so on and so on. And later on, I think it's obvious if you observe kids who start going to school. Simply the school system destroys us. You become all about competition and external motivation and grading and so on. And no school favors spontaneity and fantasy and so on, unfortunately.
But then you said that order to go through psychoanalysis, some of us have to relearn playfulness.
Yes.
So therefore it doesn't get lost in everybody that goes through the school system.
It is not completely lost in everybody, yes. And Winnicott believed if you come to psychoanalysis and you're not capable of playing, then you have to relearn it, as you said, and only then can psychotherapy start. To try psychotherapy with a person who cannot play would be completely useless. There is a concept, so to say. It's unusual to say that a poet had a concept. But Rilke had this concept of Weltinnenraum, that the space we have inside of us and the external space are in fact one. And there is no strong, solid boundary between the two. The birds fly silently to us. The tree inside me grows. What happens inside of me and what happens in the universe, that's just one basic unit, one whole. And what may seem to be outside, in fact, happens inside of me. This one is, I believe, from 1916 or 17, anyway, during the World War I. Absolutely decades before psychoanalysis would come to that, or postmodernisms and other stuff. And this is the ninth elegy. If I'd have to choose one, I believe I would choose this one. This one is about invisibility, about what's invisible and how important the invisible is, and how to make the earth invisible. Is that important notion for psychoanalysis, for where we are today, and so on? We deal in psychoanalysis with issues like identification with the analytic function. How I learn from my analyst and I identify with him or her, and then his function becomes a part of me, and I start asking the same questions and giving the same interpretations to myself. And then I don't need my analyst anymore. I can go through my life doing what his or her function used to be myself. Basically, the same process goes on between the child and the parents and in many other relationships. Other people disappear invisibly in us. And we do things or choose other people or choose professions and so on, because we believe other people are invisibly in us, but they are still alive. If you wonder how trauma is transmitted from one generation to the other, it's that it sort of is invisible in us and then speaks various languages to influence our lives still more. What Rilke wants to say here, there is this possibility of identifying or introjecting the world or another person or an object in such a fine manner, so subtly, that they truly remain invisible in us. Then they are a part of our personality structure. Then they are truly a part of us. I believe more and more, other than this, that if there is a focus of these highest parts of German culture, then this focus is invisibility. If you look at Germany from the outside, that many people talk about trains and infrastructure and organization and industry and so on and so on. And I've come to believe that these are just the means so that we will have time for focusing on invisibility. Many of you would know better, and I would like that you tell me if you don't agree. But German language and culture as we know it were founded by a monk and a priest who wanted to translate the Bible from Latin into his folk's language. And his focus was not on the church, not on what could be seen on the outside, not on the paintings in the church, but on the iron faith, on the power of faith I would have inside me. So the idea of invisibility, I think, is in the idea of self-reflection, of being focused on my mind, on the idea of mind equaling with the universe, and so on and so on. In Rilke, it goes, I think, from the level of the universe to the level that psychoanalysts are interested in. If you read number 9 in detail, I hope you'll enjoy and you will learn from it. This was originally in French. Rilke wrote a letter to his Polish translator. A guy was translating the elegies from German into Polish, and he asked Rilke for some explanations, and Rilke explained to him in French. I cannot tell you why. This is the English translation. It is our task to imprint this temporary, perishable earth into ourselves so deeply, so painfully and passionately, that its essence can rise again invisibly inside us. We are the bees of the invisible. We wildly collect the honey of the visible to store it in the great golden hive of the invisible. All of the possible earthly ambitions, aims, and so on, are ridiculous, meaningless. Who are we? We are the bees of the invisible. That's how he saw himself. If you think about the psychoanalytic work, what is it that we are doing? Someone is lying on the couch or sitting in an armchair talking about dreams, absolutely invisible. Childhood memories, highly invisible. Emotions, I'd also say more invisible than visible. Choices, anxieties, and so on and so on. And how do we react to it? We also are focused on their invisibility and our own invisibility. And in this invisible world, we try to figure out what is going on. I don't know, and I'd like to hear it.
Can this mean that invisibility is also identity with the visible, with the unconscious, with the self?
The invisibility is identical to visibility. No.
Yeah, it means to become, to get an identity with the visible in myself. So the unconscious,
Yeah.
the self.
Yeah, I think so.
To become invisible.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I agree.
Arguably, psychotherapy would claim to make it visible again, like to dig it up. That's a more common picture, isn't it? More common image.
Briefly.
I almost completely don't get the invisibility.
Briefly. The moments, at least in psychoanalytic, in depth psychological psychotherapy, the moments when things are absolutely obvious and clear and you're absolutely certain what is going on are, I think, rare. And then again, there is a new dream, there's a new recollection, there's a new anxiety, or you have forgotten something, and so on and so on. And then what happened 25 years ago may be literally true, maybe half true, and then half I reorganized it psychologically, maybe completely fantasized, and so on. And then a patient who last week or yesterday was very interesting, today is very boring, and you have no idea why, and you have to figure out who the patient reminds you of, and so on.
Never had any patients.
Sorry?
I've never had any patients.
Okay. We'll talk in a couple of years then. After this, as I told you, Rilke felt he had finished with the German language. He published a collection of poems in French, and the poems were mostly about fruit. And then he was working in the garden of his castle, and to put it so, he was thorned by a rose thorn. What did he do to him? Plucked him.
Stung him.
Yeah, thank you. And that on that spot, cancer developed. And so aged 51, he died of leukemia. For the last 3 weeks, he refused medication. He wanted to feel the pain, to experience the pain, and to experience the death of his own. Some of the biographers claim that this was very heroically, the poet living and dying his poetry. He died 1926, as I told you. Lou Salomé lived for several more years, published a book about him, rather psychoanalytically framed study, and Freud lived for 13 more years. That would be that. We are now at the end, as you can see. Nothing is in green anymore. The series ends tonight. I'm open for your questions, if you have them. But anyway, as the lecture series is concerned, thank you and bye.